Is on the Gestalt principles. Now, you may have heard of Gestalt. Um, Oftentimes it's called the Gestalt principle, but it's actually a set of theories that were put together by German psychologists, which is why it is such a funny word. It was developed in the 1920s, and basically they're starting to try to understand how the brain understands things, and we are bombarded with visual information constantly. And actually, the amount of information that we have to sort through is more than we can actually comprehend. So, how does our brain make sense of all of the input that it's getting? And it turns out that we try to simplify things in order to make sense of them. And when people started to study this, they realized that there were certain rules that we could apply, and that for the most part, they were true for almost everybody. And so, as visual creators, we can use these rules ourselves to make meaning, and we can use them to understand how people will understand our own work. So, Gestalt means a unified whole, and it basically explains that our brain tries to group things or make unified wholes when we are faced with lots of visual stimuli, and we try to make things simple when possible. You can sum up the theories of Gestalt as the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts. So for those of you who are in a sports team, you can say on paper one team should beat the other one 5-0. But when you get out there, sometimes the underdog can come together and can find reserves that actually make them better than they should be able to be, and they pull out a win. Now, there's lots of different ways to talk about the different elements that make up Gestalt. You can more or less break them into these 5 areas: similarity, continuation, closure, proximity, and figure and ground. I'm going to go through these. I'll also note what other people call them. And I've got some visual examples throughout, and you'll notice that at times the same idea will have similar but not exactly the same names when different people are talking about them. And this is part of the thing when a theory is developed in one language and then it gets translated into another, and we've all been working on these various ideas in different schools in art and design. You get a lot of talk about Gestalt when you're talking about iconography, when you're talking about making logos, when you're talking about user interface design and user experience. And so you can have 2 people talk about the same thing and we're separated by a common language. So this is part of why I want us to just kind of get the ideas in, and to understand the thing that kind of pins them all together. So when we talked about unity and variety in the last set of slides, we talked about at the end where we had that really chaotic image, but that when we look at something really chaotic, our brain groups things that are similar together. So if we have a whole bunch of dots in a jumble, but a bunch of them are blue and the other bunch are green, we're going to assume that the blue dots and the green dots make up 2 different sets. We're going to mentally join them into a whole because we think things that look similar probably go together. Another example here is this logo that's got a sun and an eagle. Now, you could say that there are 11 different objects here, but you probably see a sun and an eagle. Now, there's a similarity between the way that the bottom of the eagle is formed with those 3 triangles that protrude out and the triangles that form the sun. Because of that, we pull it all together into one image. We're going to talk in a moment about why we see all the other different triangles in the form of a sun there. But overall, we put the eagle together with the sun because they are similar. A corollary to this is that things that are dissimilar jump out at us. So if you had a whole pestle full of green apples and 1 red apple, your eye would be immediately drawn to the red apple. And this is called the von Restorff effect. So the thing that's the anomaly, the thing that seems out of place, our attention is drawn to it. So again, this is something we can use to our advantage. So in this case, we've got 3 people who are the same and then a jumping person. And so our eye is going to be drawn to that jumping person. Now we know it's part of that group because it shares so many characteristics with the other people, but its movement and its dissimilarity draws our eye to it. And here's an example using some dots. Continuation is when the eye is compelled to move through one object and continue that motion into another object. It's sometimes called continuity. I like continuation because it's a continuance of one thing into another. Again, we see this a lot in logo design where there is a feeling of motion that's implied and that travels through one thing into another. Closure is what we used in the case of that circle in the very first example. It's when we have an object that's incomplete, or you have a space that's not completely enclosed, but enough of the shape is there for us to fill in the rest. When I learned Gestalt back in my college days, this was the definition of Gestalt that was used. It's the idea that you have a few lines, but we'll put those lines together and we form a horse, so we see a horse with it. Similarly, you see a soccer ball on the image to the left. Even though the positive space of the soccer ball is missing, in fact, it's just the negative space there, we fill it in with our brains. Proximity, we also looked a little bit at in the last slide of the unity and variety section. And that we talk about the things that are close together, we perceive them as being together as a group. So on the left, we have squares that aren't in any real rhyme or reason. They're not very close together. Whereas once you get close enough together, and especially in this case there's a regularity, our brain assumes that it's actually one square that maybe has a texture to it. Again, if these people were placed further apart, we wouldn't see them as a tree, but instead would see them as flying people. Here, the law of proximity forms all of these into two columns. Instead of seeing 6 individual columns, we see it as 2 columns of 3 columns of dots. Figure ground is the kind of Gestalt analog to positive and negative space. So we see an object and that positive form as different from its surrounding negative space. We kind of naturally perceive the object as the figure, and the area around it is going to be perceived of as the ground or the background. Balancing these two can make either the perceived image clearer, or you can play with the relationship between them to add interest. And again, this is something that, as we saw in terms of positive and negative space, that we play with a lot when we're making logos, but it's also something that when you're designing user interfaces, if you're making an app, for example, you have a very, very limited amount of space to work with, and so playing with that can be a way to really creatively utilize the space you have at your disposal. The law of common region is what we were talking about in terms of when you're looking at, say, your phone and you have the bottom 4 apps that are grouped together. The idea that things that are grouped together tend to be similar. Again, this might be the way that if you need to remember a phone number, you remember them in kind of groups. It's related to uniform connectedness. So if you were to see this set, we don't see it as 6 different circles. We see it as 2 big circles, each of which have 2 smaller circles within. We don't necessarily relate the 4 red dots together. Instead, we separate them out into 2 sets of red dots based on the fact that they're both enclosed by a single large blue circle. The law of common region is sometimes called the law of common fate. Now, we have this perception as humans that if things are kind of going the same way, they're going together, they're all going at the same speed as like a group, that the reason that they're going that way, well, they're going to the same place, and the reason they're going there is the same. So this is sometimes also used both in terms of experience design, but also in psychology. And for me, the easiest way to think of this is when you see a bunch of birds flying, either Canadian geese in their V, or you've got like a bunch of sparrows and a murmuration. When you see a whole ton of birds flying in the same direction, you don't assume it's by chance. you assume that they're all going together to the same place for some reason, food, breeding, whatever it may be. It doesn't just happen that a bunch of them, all out of sheer coincidence, are moving the same way at the same time at the same speed. We just kind of assume that there's a purpose. So that's what's meant by the law of common region, or the law of common fate. Now, I particularly love that the law of simplicity is often known as Pragnatz, because that is like the least simple way for someone who's not German to think of it. But if someone talks about Pragnatz, that's what they mean. In design, sometimes it is called the law of good figure. I prefer the law of simplicity because I think it kind of boils down all of Gestalt into one idea, at least for me. That is, when we are faced with a complicated set of visual information, if we can form it into a single object, we will. If we have ambiguous or complex imagery, we're going to try to make it into a single, simple form, because that's the easiest thing for our brain to comprehend. And that's why, to me, it kind of incorporates all of the other laws together. So if we're looking at, this is basically the Olympic rings, just in one color, there's so many ways that you could think of forming it. You could see it as 5 different individual circles. You could see it as the area of overlap between each of these circles, but that's not really how we understand it. We understand it as a singular concept. And that's basically what you boil down Gestalt into. It's that if you have something that's complicated, our brain is going to try to simplify it, because there's just too much input that we are faced with on a regular basis, and the only way we can survive is by simplifying things. And so that's why it's so useful as a tool for us as designers or communicators, visual communicators, or in any other way. It's a good way to think about how we as humans deal with sensory input, that when possible we'll fill in the gaps and try to make sense out of it, because otherwise there's just too much going on.